I think the really interesting thing is that if you look at the defensive stats of both teams in the Bundesliga this season, they're almost identical. Um, so far this season, Dortmund have faced 58 shots, Bayern Munich have faced 59. So far this season, Dortmund have faced 15 shots on target. So far, Bayern have faced 13. So they're almost identical, and there's only like one or two goals between them in terms of actual goals conceded. When you then flip that on its head and look at the attacking stats, that's when the two teams really kind of differ. Obviously, Bayern are just kind of like the Harlem Globetrotters of the Bundesliga at the moment, and they've hit 113 shots compared to Dortmund's 72, 52 shots on target compared to Dortmund's 31. They've obviously got like the star-studded attacking lineup, but I mean, having said that, once you kind of take penalties out of it, Bayern are sitting on 21 goals, having racked up an XG of 13, which to me is kind of wild, to be honest with you. And then you can just kind of think, like, anecdotally, back to games and how many times like Serge Gnabry's fired in a shot from the most acute angle, Harry Kane scoring from the edge of the box, maybe Luis Diaz curling in one or two shots into the far corner, and that all lines up. But it does kind of make me think, well, how long can that last? To an extent, they can't keep scoring world class goals every single weekend. Maybe they can, I don't know, but it's a really excuse me. That's kind of why I keep kind of coming back to how Bayern will perform when they play against teams capable of putting up more resistance to that. And maybe that's where Dortmund will be. Maybe Dortmund will be the team that can stop Serge from Gnabry from getting those chances. Maybe Dortmund is the team that can actually cut off the service to Harry Kane in the box. Maybe they're the team that can actually keep Luis Diaz quiet. Then what happens to this kind of, gung-ho, free-scoring Bayern side? Because I do keep coming back to that defensive line and thinking there's just no way that a Bayern team with Konrad Laimer and Sacha Boey as their fullbacks should be cakewalking to a Bundesliga title. I just don't buy it at all. I know Konrad Laimer's been like one of the kind of unsung heroes of this Bayern team. I know he really puts he really absolutely fires through performance after performance, whether at right back or left back. He does get absolutely stuck in, but he's not a world-class fullback by any means. And
it's a bit of a dilemma, It's a bit of a dilemma, isn't it, for Kovac as to what extent he tries to exploit that? Because if there are potential weaknesses for Bayern, maybe they are in those fullback positions with Boe and Lima, and he would want Adeyemi to try and get particularly at those fullback positions. But on the other hand, I see Dortmund struggling in midfield. So you're going to have a slightly more conservative approach, maybe to protect Sabitzer and Mecha in the centre, against the likes of Diaz chopping a bit deeper in there, Kimmich, Pavlovic. I think Dortmund could struggle there. So getting that balance right between offensively attacking Bayern's fullback positions, but also protecting a slightly slower, potentially weaker central midfield is going to be a bit of a dilemma for Kovac, I think.
I think that's a really good point, because that's the thing that really stood out to me in the Leipzig game and I think that's where Leipzig really got to Dortmund, and perhaps for Dortmund were a little surprised at how Leipzig were able to overload that midfield, because I can't remember who started that game. It might have been Mecha and Sabitzer, but it felt like Leipzig really took advantage of having an extra body in there, and they were able to kind of control the game more than Dortmund expected it to be. I think Dortmund were a wee bit surprised. Now, you could maybe say that game kind of is maybe shaken that Dortmund team out of complacency, and they've realised, like, we can't, but maybe begin to believe the hype a little bit too much ourselves, and that might bode well for them going into this game. But I mean, we can maybe come on to like which kind of aspects of the game we think will be important. But I think if I was Niko Kovac, I'd be trying to find a way to get the ball on top of Sacha Boey and Konrad Laimer throughout the match, and getting, whether that's Bayer or Adeyemi or Guirassy or whoever running at him at speed, because that's kind of, to me, it feels like that's a kind of soft underbelly to this Bayern team.
If there is one, yeah.
I mean, that gets us kind of almost already into the key players or crucial players or things to look out for in this game beyond the two head coaches. I think you both raised some really interesting points. Konrad Laimer, the wing back situation. I mean, that is at this stage simply a stopgap, isn't it? For Bayern Munich in particular, until Alphonso Davies comes back. And reports today suggesting that will be December. That's what Vincent Kompany said. Mentioned at least in his press conference before the match. But I think that Bayern Munich team, having seen them now a few times, they're just so very strong and compact. And if there is defensive issues, it is up to Borussia Dortmund to see whether they can fully exploit that. And one of the problems I think for Dortmund has been, and we have to get into that, is that although Sergio Guirassy has scored 4 goals in 5 games, by his own standards that he set last year, isn't quite the same kind of level that he had before, right? The Champions League in particular stands out, where he was, I think, one of the top scorers, if not the top scorer last season, right? And so, the thing is, when you play against Bayern Munich, you cannot afford to miss many chances. So we will have to have Sergio Guirassy in top form. I made one big mistake my holiday, and I watched the Germany-Northern Ireland game. And I could have gone to bed half an hour earlier if Karim Adeyemi had scored that chance. But that's so typical of him, isn't it? Right? And he cannot afford to miss that sort of chance against Bayern Munich when it presents itself, and it will present itself. And so those are I guess, where we get into the key battles. There is defensive weaknesses in this Bayern Munich team, but do Borussia Dortmund have enough players in form right now to exploit that in their own attack? Because I think defensively, Dortmund are actually in a very good position at the moment. And I think that's sort of what you were alluding to, Stefan, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think defensively speaking, Dortmund are in a good spot. I'm still wary of Benzbaini. I think he still has something of what I tend to call a brain fart in him, where he just kind of drops the ball to, mix up my sporting metaphors from time to time. And as Matt correctly points out, I think that midfield, if it is going to be Sabitzer and Mecha, we're going to have to be at the top of their game to kind of make sure they don't get overloaded. But in terms of the key player for me from both teams, I think it's going to be Daniel Svensson. I think if you want to stop this Bayern team, you have to stop Michael Olise. He's their playmaker. He's the guy who gets things ticking for them. He also scores a lot of goals as well. And I'm going to be really intrigued to see how Svensson does again. Svensson's obviously been this kind of revelation since he joined Dortmund. He's kind of going from strength to strength. He's put in some great kind of one-on-one defensive performances for Dortmund this year. And I'll be really intrigued to see how he does. And if we do start to see Olise kind of drift inside or move to alongside Kimmich in midfield, then we'll know that Svensson's done his job. At which point it'll then be up to someone like Mecha or Sabitzer or whoever else to kind of keep an eye on him. But I think that'll be first and foremost. If Olise can get the better of Svensson, then Dortmund are going to have a really tough time of it.
I think that's a good point, and I think I suspect maybe for some people the gut reaction to that would be, how on earth is Daniel Svensson going to handle Michael Olise in this sort of current form? And I can understand where, perhaps if you don't necessarily watch Borussia Dortmund or watch Daniel Svensson that much, you might think that. However, one game really stands out in my mind. Daniel Svensson's best game for Borussia Dortmund, in my opinion. That was the second leg at home to Barcelona last year. Now, admittedly, the fixture was probably over, given the defeat in Spain. But Dortmund did win that game on the night. And Daniel Svensson, I remember being sat there at the Westfalen Stadion and watching, thinking, I turned up to that game to watch Lamine Yamal. If I'm being honest, I thought the tie was over. The tie was over. I thought I almost didn't go to the game. I thought, what's the point? But then I thought, no, this is a good chance to watch a good Barcelona team, and I want to have a look at Lamine Yamal in person. And Daniel Svensson, particularly in the first half, had him in his pocket. It was an outstanding performance. So he absolutely does have that in him. I think, as Stefan said, absolutely underrated player in this Borussia Dortmund team. And he has shown that he absolutely can handle the best.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. I mentioned it in the preview article I did on Gegenpressing, right? Swenson leads the league with 75 kilometers covered and 546 intensive runs, right? And these are the stats provided by the Bundesliga themselves, in case people wonder. I think he has been incredible this season. In the Champions League also, right? There was that moment against Athletic Bilbao where the game seemed to go the other direction, right? Where Dortmund were on the brink of conceding the 2-2. And he had that defensive moment where you were just like, this is unbelievable, where he not only cleared the ball, but he cleared it in a way that would end up with his own teammate in an absolute impossible situation. And he has that space of mind and understanding of space that is so very important. But he also really makes the transition game work for Dortmund, because he covers so much ground and he's so quick in like being able to move the ball from his defensive line forward. And we talked in great length on this show and in our articles on how many bad signings Dortmund have made for a lot of money. They signed him for 6.5 million euros. And I think his market value has gone up to 22.5, I think, on Transfermarkt. I still think that's underrated. A player like him is so valuable and so rare to find. And I think, if Dortmund want to get something from that game, he will be crucial. He will have to be able to shut off the attackers, and it is possible. I was in Frankfurt for the Frankfurt Bayern game, and while Frankfurt were really poor, Nathaniel Brown actually had a really good game shutting down Michael Olise, which shows it can be done, right? And I think that's where there's so much focus on, this is Borussia against Kane. And then the Bundesliga did this Instagram post where they put the stats next to each other and you just shake your head and like, why? Why did you do this to yourself? But this is really, the game doesn't come down to Kane against Borussia. It comes down to Dortmund shutting down Bayern's attack. So they really should have made this Kane against Swenson.
Yeah. I think that's the kind of really impressive thing about Kovac's tactics. He's took what was probably Dortmund's weak point, which was their fullback positions, and made it a strength, because when you have Ryerson and Svensson playing as wing backs, they can really attack with the kind of tenacity that is their strong point without really worrying about the space behind them, because they typically have a centre-back who can come over and cover for them. It's definitely got the best out of Benzemaini, because he's not left in these kind of 1v1 situations. He can play more of a sweeper. And even like Kutu. I mean, Kutu was useless under Nuri Sahin, but this year alone, he's kind of came on leaps and bounds because he can play as a wing-back as opposed to just a kind of full-back. And I've been intrigued to see who's Kovac actually goes for in this game, because Ryerson would be the obvious choice at right-back, but in Kutu, he has a player that can counter-attack very, very quickly.
There was a really interesting piece, actually, and I was reading in Kicker this week regarding that interplay between Julian Ryerson and Jan Couto at... are we saying Couto or Cout? My Portuguese is terrible, so I don't know. Anyway, but yeah, regarding the interplay between those two, and again, we said before about Kovac finding a balance. Even there, in that particular right back position, he has to find that balance to make those decisions. At what point do you need a player like Jan Couto who can perhaps offer you a lot more going forward than Julian Ryerson? Or at what point in the game do you have to make that decision and say, no, at this point, Ryerson would be better because we need more stability? I would suggest that Bayern Munich away, you tend more towards Ryerson, at least from the start, and then perhaps, depending on how the game goes, if Dortmund are in the game, if you do recognise opportunities to get in behind Bayern Munich on the right-hand side, you bring on a Jan Couto because you can interplay better with Adeyemi and create those overloads on the right-hand side. Again, these are all the dilemmas and the balancing acts that Niko Kovac, that's his job to solve, and it's probably a good position with good problems for Borussia Dortmund and positive problems that they have to solve, and problems which they would probably prefer to have compared to issues in previous years. So, yeah, but balancing acts and dilemmas for Dortmund, but in a positive sense, I think.